Good morning. Time now a minute after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, May 13th, 2022. Welcome to another edition of the online seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I'm Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize online morning seminars introducing the latest World Bank report with our economists and specialists. This morning, we'll be introducing the latest edition of the Women, Business and the Law 2022 edition, published on March the 1st. In the past seminars in our program, we featured the 2018 edition, 2019 edition, and 2021 edition. Somehow we missed the 2020 edition. But fortunately, we are making it another tradition of ours to introduce the Women, Business and the Law report every year to the audience in Japan once published. We have the two World Bank specialists joining from Washington. Let me introduce each one of them very briefly. We have Natalia Mazzoni, the private sector development specialist in the Women, Business and the Law program. Natalia, good morning. Can you hear me?
Hi, Koichi. Hi, good morning, everyone, and good evening from Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be here again, and I'm so glad that this is now a tradition with the Tokyo Country Office. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Great. Welcome back to our seminar program, Natalia. Next, we have Victoria Kaitina, legal consultant at the same Women, Business and the Law program in Washington. Good evening, good morning to you, Victoria. Welcome to our program.
Hi, hello from Washington, D.C. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this kind invitation. And it's truly an honor for us to be here this morning to discuss the work we're doing at the World Bank Women, Business and the Law project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Natalia and Victoria are the members of the production team of the Women, Business and Law report. We'll be listening to them presenting the main findings of the 2022 edition in the next 30-40 minutes. As usual, we already received several questions from the audience, and thank you very much for sending your question. If you have more questions, please send even during the presentation by using the online form posted on the website announcement page on our website of this seminar, or you can simply post your question on the YouTube screen in the chat section that I'll read your question, asking the speakers to respond after their presentation. With that, I would like to ask Natalia, Victoria to come in to start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Koichi. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started with the presentation.
I will take it from here. Thank you, Koichi, for your kind introduction. And it's truly an honor for us to be here with you this morning today. And we would like the session to be interactive, and we would like to hear from you. So I also included some questions for you and look forward to hearing your voice during this session. So during this presentation, we will provide a brief overview of our project, followed by our findings, highlights from our new areas of research, legal framework for childcare and implementation of laws, how our data is being used in operations, and finally, an overview of our new website. Climate change, forced displacement, and violent conflict are increasingly urgent development challenges for the global population. Evidence from current and past crises shows that women are affected disproportionately. Discriminatory laws are holding women back from reaching their full potential, threatening not only their economic security, but their communities and countries as well. We know more today about the importance of equality of opportunity than we used to. We know that it's not only important because women are entitled to equal rights, but we also know that there are economic benefits to gender equality. Greater gender equality is associated with narrowing the gender gap in development outcomes, higher female labor force participation, lower vulnerable employment, and greater representation of women in national parliaments. Women earn only 2/3 of men's expected lifetime income. Therefore, reducing the inequalities in economic opportunity would close the pay gap and, if achieved, would result in increased earnings for women. Over more than 1 decade, our team has been investigating one question: how do laws affect a woman's working life? And around this topic, we have been dedicated to improving our products and delivering a series of publications that are evidence-based, data-driven, and advancing with the times. And Women Business and Law Report is now considered a World Bank Group flagship publication. And in case you didn't know that this already, our research covers 190 economies, and we rely on over 10,000 legal experts around the world to help us collect this data and inform our analysis. To track the discriminatory laws that affect women's working lives, we created the Women Business and Law Index, which provides economy-level scores on the achievement of gender equality in the law. The Women Business and the Law Legal Index measures explicit discrimination in the law, legal rights, and the provision of certain benefits. The goal of the index is to allow data users to see how laws affect women's prospects as employees and entrepreneurs in a given economy, with the hope of inspiring legal reforms. The index is structured around 8 different milestones of a woman's working life, called indicators, which you can see here on the screen, and is composed of 35 questions. Questions included in the indicators were chosen based on evidence from the economic literature, as well as statistically significant associations with outcomes related to women's economic empowerment, such as employment and business ownership. The index provides indicator and economy level scores, with 100 representing the highest possible score. Our data is based on assumptions about a woman in question and on the laws applicable in the largest business city. There is clear evidence that laws captured by the Women Business and Law Index are associated with greater economic empowerment for women. Apart from the human rights aspect, greater legal equality is associated with a larger supply of female labor, a smaller gender wage gap, higher level of female entrepreneurship, and a greater number of women in managerial positions. New data from the World Bank We Data project also reveals that the greater the equality between men and women in the law, as expressed by the Women in Business and Law Index, the higher the share of female entrepreneurs, as you can see from the figure on the left. Recent research analyzing women business and law data in conjunction with the data from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys shows that a more discriminatory legal environment is associated with a greater probability that businesses led by women will commence operations in the informal sector. In economies where the aggregate Women Business and Law Index score is higher, businesses with women owners are less likely to have begun operating in the informal sector. And this negative correlation is displayed in the figure on the right. So what are some of the interesting findings of our 2022 report? Yet all over the world, discriminatory laws are amplifying the effects of an already difficult period. The global average women business and law score is 76.5 out of 100, indicating that a typical woman has just 3/4 of the rights of men in the areas measured. Nearly 2.4 billion women of working age globally still are not afforded equal economic opportunities. Women Business and the Law 2022 report identifies where and in what areas this is the case, providing important data for achieving women's full and equal participation. And before we continue with our key findings, we have a question for you. In how many economies do you think women hold the same legal rights as men? Please head over to the link here or scan the QR code to access the online question. And we will also paste the link in case you prefer to access the question that way. But once on the Menti poll, please select an answer to the best of your knowledge, and we will give you 30 seconds to answer and wait a little bit. Already see some results coming in. Okay, that's very optimistic. Well, but if you have selected 12, congratulations. In this year, Women Business in the Law 2022 Index, we now have 12 countries that score 100. They are all from high-income OECD economies, with Greece and Spain joining the group, which previously included Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Ireland, Latvia, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Sweden. But that means that in 178 economies, there is room for reform to legal barriers to enhance women's economic opportunities. The highest and lowest scoring regions remain the same as last year, with economies in the OECD high-income region, Europe and Central Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean, scoring above the global average. The Middle East and North Africa have the lowest regional averages. While progress has been made, the pace of reforms must be accelerated. Every region has examples of economies whose governments are implementing good practice laws and those that still have room to improve. Countries can look to their neighbors for examples when seeking to implement reforms or inspire others to do so. And here I just want to bring to your attention that we have a great data visualization tool on our website that allows you to make this regional and even country-specific analysis and comparison. The mobility, workplace, marriage, entrepreneurship, and assets indicators have an average global score above 80, meaning that most economies have removed restrictions or introduced the relevant legal rights and protections measured by these indicators. Average scores are lower for the pay, parenthood, and pension indicators. Parenthood, with an average score of 55.6, has the most room to improve, followed by the pay indicator. 19 economies score 0 in parenthood indicator, meaning that they do not have any of the good practices measured by this indicator. Only 26% of all economies measured have a paid parental leave policies where parents can share the burden of care after childbirth. And actually, Colombia became the first country in LAC to introduce such measure in the past year. And talking about reforms, gradually, we see that progress is happening. And this is a difficult time for any country to reform. And yet, 23 governments addressed this inequality by introducing legal reforms to ensure women's empowerment. In total, the 39 laws changed because of these reforms, 10 of which were enacted in the Middle East and North Africa. This region advanced the most as a result of these efforts, with 25% of economies implementing at least one reform. Economies in Europe and Central Asia also passed reforms, with 17% of economies changing at least one law to improve gender equality. Additionally, many reforms were recorded in Western and Central Africa. Gabon stands out undertaking comprehensive revision to its civil code and enacting a law to eliminate violence against women, which affected 9 of the 15 data points for which the country previously recorded a no answer across 5 indicators: mobility, workplace, marriage, entrepreneurship, and assets. And the parenthood indicator, with positive changes in 8 data points across 8 countries, recorded the highest number of reforms, followed by workplace and pay. The overall score for Japan is 78.8 out of 100, the same as 4 other economies around the world. They are Azerbaijan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Philippines, and Tajikistan. The overall score for Japan is higher than the women business in the law in the index global average of 76.5, but lower than the high-income OECD economies average of 95.2. And we will take a closer look at each area measured by women business in the law to understand where the strengths and opportunities for improvements are. So just give you a big picture of where Japan stands within the Women Business and Law Index when it comes to constraints on freedom of movement, laws affecting women's work after having children, gender differences in property and inheritance, and laws affecting the size of a woman's pension. Japan gets a perfect score of 100. That is in the indicators mobility, parenthood, assets, and pension. Although when it comes to laws affecting women's decision to work, laws affecting women's pay, constraints related to marriage, and constraints on women starting and running a business, Japan could consider reforms to improve legal equality for women. And here you can see how the country compares with other countries within the high-income OECD group, as well as the world. So let's dive into each of the indicators to understand what is measured and what gaps persist. Mobility indicator measures restrictions to women's freedom of movement and agency, both within and outside the household. Removing restrictions on women's mobility is important to enable women to join the labor force and open their own businesses. Japan scores 100 in the mobility indicator, although we would like to highlight that legal gaps in this area still persist globally, so it's important to raise awareness about regulatory gaps. For example, in 35 countries, women cannot choose where to live in the same way as men. Our next indicator is workplace. The workplace indicator analyzes laws affecting women's decision to enter the labor force, including their legal capacity and ability to work, as well as protections in the workplace against discrimination and sexual harassment. Japan is the only economy among all high-income OECD economies that still does not have legislation on sexual harassment in employment and does not establish criminal penalties or civil remedies for sexual harassment in employment. Sexual harassment in the workplace is still pervasive. While there is a lack of global and regional data on the prevalence of sexual harassment, country studies show that workplace sexual harassment imposes an economic cost that is shared by individuals, employers, governments, and society. Globally, 46 economies still do not have legislation on sexual harassment in employment. And the last high-income OECD economy to pass a reform to ensure legal protection against sexual harassment in employment was the United Kingdom in 2011. Good practice example from the region is Slovenia, which defines sexual harassment under the Employment Relations Act. Another good practice example is Ireland, where the Employment Equality Act provides that sexual harassment in employment is a form of discrimination by the victim's employer in relation to the victim's conditions of employment. Our next indicator is pay. The pay indicator measures laws affecting occupational segregation and the gender wage gap. Restrictions on certain jobs have been found to be negatively correlated with female employment. This indicator has 4 components that assess whether the law mandates equal remuneration for work of equal value, whether women can work the same night hours as men, whether women can work in jobs deemed dangerous in the same way as men, and whether women can work in the same industries as men. In Japan, we observe areas for improvements in 2 areas: equal pay and job restrictions. We have found that 123 economies still have at least one restriction on the jobs women can hold. The restrictions on women's employment can have real consequences for their earning potential. In countries where with labor restrictions, fewer women work and the general pay gap is likely to be larger. And just to explore a bit more the topic of equal pay, I bring here a few examples of a language from the region. What does equal pay for work of equal value mean? This standard originates from the ILO Equal Pay Convention and provides a broader framework than equal pay for equal work, since it allows a comparison not only between the same or similar jobs, but also between different jobs of equal value. It also means that equality will be evaluated at a higher level than just salary. Remuneration includes salary, but also all other benefits. So there are 2 parts of this principle: equal remuneration and work of equal value. And we don't observe these 2 requirements in the legislation in Japan. Now let me stop here and I will pass it over to Natalia, who will continue with the findings of our newest report.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I will move on now to marriage, which is our next indicator. And under this indicator, we measure legal constraints that are related to women's marriage, their ability to divorce, and to eventually remarry, and also laws related to domestic violence. And in this indicator, Japan scores 80. And this is because the Japanese Civil Code still contains a provision that pregnant women still have to wait 100 days so they can remarry, meaning that there's still a restriction to women's ability to get divorced and marry again in the same way as men. And while countries have improved in this area, we see that a little over a third of the countries that we cover still restrict women's ability to remarry. Moving on then to the parenthood indicator, this indicator measures laws affecting the ability of new parents to take time off work and whether pregnant women are protected against dismissal during pregnancy. And a closer look at this indicator reveals that of the 190 economies that we cover at Women, Business, and the Law, in 42 economies, a woman can still be fired just because she's pregnant. And this indicator also covers the provision of maternity, paternity, and parental leave benefits. And these are very important areas to measure because, as we've seen in recent studies, paid leave, whether through maternity, paternity, or parental leave, may encourage a more equitable distribution of household responsibilities between parents. And parental leave specifically, it's a very new trend. Out of the 190 countries that we cover, only 50, including Japan, have these kind of policies in place where parents can share portions of paid leave to balance childcare duties. And just a quick note, although we see this in the law, we are aware that the uptake of these policies is still a challenge for many countries. So the burden of caretaking still falls on women. But in the past year, we saw 8 economies passing reforms that introduced family leave policies. For example, Armenia, Switzerland, and Ukraine introduced paid paternity leave. Colombia, Georgia, Greece, and Spain introduced paid parental leave. And as Victoria mentioned a while ago, Colombia became actually the second economy in geographically Latin America, aside from Chile, to introduce paid parental leave. And I would just wanted to mention that for details about each of the reforms that we are talking about here today, you can visit our website at wbl.worldbank.com. We do have a section there that covers all the reforms that we've been capturing over the past few years. So that's a great insight on all of this data and interesting stories that we're sharing here today. So after parenthood, the next indicator we look at is entrepreneurship, which analyzes constraints on women's starting and running a business. And we look at whether the law prohibits discrimination in access to credit, whether a woman can sign a contract, run a business, and open a bank account in the same way as a man. And that's because access to financial services in particular is crucial for entrepreneurs. We know that to start a business, a person needs to access finance, which requires formal credit and good credit score. And sometimes you also need to provide property as a collateral for loans. But these discriminatory laws can affect women's access to financial services and impede their ability to save, borrow, pay, or even insure themselves against risk. And in this particular area, we see that Japan still has to improve because currently there are no laws that prohibit gender discrimination in access to credit. But we've seen that some countries are showcasing best practices in this area. So here we bring two examples, one from OECD high income. We have an example of the United States, but another good example that we found in our latest report is Gabon. Before Gabon passed the reform that we captured last year, a husband had to be notified when his wife opened a bank account. But then in 2021, this restriction was removed from the legislation in Gabon after the reform of the civil code. And now women in Gabon can have equal access to bank accounts as men. And these provisions on discriminations were teared down. Moving on to assets, and actually Japan gets a perfect score on the next two indicators that I'm going to talk about, both assets and pension. And when we take a closer look at the assets indicator, we see that this is the area where the least number of reforms happen in the past 52 years. You can see here in the graph where we have this red dotted line, the assets indicator saw the least increase in score over the past half a century, only 17.7 points. And this slow pace of change in the assets indicator may stem from the difficulty of reforming laws that govern property ownership and inheritance. And that's especially when ingrained social norms really dictate inheritance rules in certain countries. So even when new legislation is passed, the implementation of these laws and their actualization, their reality in practice is often hindered by these societal standards and women's lack of awareness of their rights. And now we reach the final indicator, which is pension. And that we covered this important area because throughout their working lives, women face several obstacles that limit their opportunities and prevent them from thriving at work in the same way as men. But regardless of where they live, where they're from, where they live, working women still have one thing in common. Eventually, they'll reach an age at which they have to retire. And one of the areas that we cover within this indicator is we look at whether men and women can retire and receive full pension benefits at the same age. And just for a little bit of context, the full pension benefits is the one that you receive once you've fulfilled all the requirements that are established in the law in order to retire and receive your old age pension. So what we see here is that all around the world, 65 economies still set different ages for men and women to retire and receive full pension benefits. And comparing this age gap, we see that the average pension age gap is 4 years. So from the map here, you can see that the age gap exists in every region of the world. And this ranges from 10 months, as in Lithuania, meaning that men retire at a higher age by 10 months in comparison to women, up to 10 years in China. But the average gap in retirement is narrowing over time as more countries are introducing pension schemes that are aimed at equalizing these ages for ages of retirement. So in the past couple of years, our team, the WBL team, has undertook a massive effort to research and calculate how the index looked like all the way back to 1970, and to also capture all the effort that's been done by the economies that we cover. So we kept track of 52 years of reforms over the years. And like I said, we did that for all the 190 economies. And here we can see the progress made by Japan. The country has come a long way throughout the years, enacted 6 reforms, going from an average score of 62.5 in 1971 to 78.8 in 2021, which is the year that corresponds to our 2022 report. But as we've highlighted throughout the presentation, there's still work to be done to make sure that women have the same opportunities as men, both at home, at work, and as entrepreneurs. But if the pace of change stays the same, we'll need at least another 50 years to achieve legal gender parity all over the world. Based on some of the increases that we observed in our research, we noticed that the OECD high-income economies will be the first to potentially reach an average score of 100 by 2025, 3 years from now, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean in 2043, and Europe and Central Asia by 2045. So there's still a lot of work to be done so we can speed up this process and reach legal gender equality faster. And now I wanted to move on to some of the new areas of research that we introduced in this latest report. And one of the new areas that we started developing since last year is looking at the frameworks to measure legal barriers to the provision of childcare services. And this exercise included 95 economies, and unfortunately, it did not include Japan, but we are hoping to expand the scope and cover all economies, all 190 economies in the coming years. And here, under this research and under the scope of this new area of research, we look at 3 pillars. The first one is availability, meaning how the laws can expand access to childcare services. The second pillar is affordability, or how can everyone benefit from these services, including and most importantly, low-income families. And the third pillar is quality of childcare services, and that is to ensure a safe and beneficial learning environment for children. And the reason why we decided to look into these 3 pillars and these 3 areas, it's because policies that target access to affordable and quality childcare services can have a far-reaching positive impact, not only for women, so they can join and stay the labor market, but also for child development. So together, this boosts economic growth and creates more abundant and diverse workforce and offers substantial business and employment opportunities for everyone. So here I wanted to zoom in some of our findings in this research. So when we look at the area of availability of childcare services, we notice that this varies widely across regions. Most OECD high-income and Europe and Central Asia economies regulate public childcare services, but in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, regulations tend to mandate the private sector or the employers to provide care services for children of working parents. So a few examples, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, a company that employs a certain number of women is obligated by law to provide childcare, either directly on the premises or through financial assistance to employees. And also there's an aspect of working hours, and here flexibility and duration is important to provide a real alternative for working parents. And of the 55 economies that regulate both public and private provision of childcare services, just 8 establish minimum required hours of operation. Then moving on to the second pillar of affordability. Globally, over 80% of economies do not provide free childcare services. And then when you look at the OECD high income, that is marginally higher at 12%. But policy measures that can ease this financial burden and facilitate the uptake of childcare are giving financial support or preferential tax treatment. And that can be either to the parents or directly to the providers of childcare services. And in most cases, such financial support is provided under a set of conditions. For example, household level of income, work status of parents, number of hours that the child spends in the facility, among others. And finally, regulations around the quality standards. We see here that setting minimum standards of quality, by setting these minimum standards, governments can ensure that the providers offer a high quality care. But there are some burdensome quality requirements may disincentivize childcare providers from operating. So what we are trying to understand here is how to set the right balance between an requests that are overburdening childcare providers or with the right quality of care. And our analyzed data includes licensing requirements, mandates on teacher to child ratio, and maximum group sizes. Also includes periodic training requirements for teachers, for example. And also training for teachers is linked to improved learning and well-being of children. And it also promotes career development for the teachers who are predominantly women. So some requirements on contiguous training exist in most regions, but there are not clear international standards in this area. And here under this pillar, we also analyze compliance mechanisms such as mandatory inspections and reporting requirements for service providers. And when it comes to private providers of childcare, most countries require them to obtain a license or some form of authorization to operate. However, this is the case for public providers in only 70% of the economy is covered. But we continue to work on this research, and we hope to provide even more insights on all these measures as we expand our scope and continue doing this research in the next year. And we have received so much feedback on our work over the years, and all pointing to the fact that beyond having good laws in the books, the proper implementation and enforcement of these laws are a critical barrier to gender equality. And as we like to say, we just don't want to see a law on equal pay. We want women to actually receive equal pay. So to present a fuller picture of the legal environment for women, our latest report, the 2022 report, introduced a new conceptual framework for measuring the implementation gap. And this pilot exercise included 25 economies from all regions and examined both the supportive frameworks that create an enabling environment for working women and a component on the expert opinions of progress made towards gender equality of individuals on the ground. And when we talk about supportive frameworks, we mean after the laws are passed, what needs to happen next? How can rights be effectively enforced? How can benefits be provided? How can we ensure that barriers to women's economic inclusion have been removed in practice as well? So what we found in these 25 economies is that only half of these supportive frameworks for the adequate implementation of laws actually exist. And that indicates that there is a gap between the passage of laws and their implementation. While these results are preliminary and they're only representative of a very small sample, we have a lot of work to do to continue developing this exercise a bit better over the coming years. But what we see is already a confirmation that laws alone are not enough to improve gender equality. So our goal now is to continue exploring this area and improving these measurements so we can have a more robust result in the coming years. And in the next slide, I just have a quick glance on the OECD high-income country economies that we covered in this exercise. And because of the small sample, we only covered 4 countries. So Canada, France, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. And you see here that there's great variation within indicators. You see that the gaps of actual implementation, the supportive framework in comparison with the legal index is higher in assets, for example, and entrepreneurship. And then you have a smaller gap in marriage and pension, for example. So we want to have a better sense of how these implementation measures are working across countries. And we hope we can come back next year or maybe in a couple of years and give you a bit more information about this new area of research. So as we move towards the end of our presentation, we're going to touch a little bit on how the WBL data is informing the reform agenda and promoting changes toward gender equality around the world. So since 2016, the Women, Business and the Law team has organized in-country workshops with civil society organizations in 17 sub-Saharan countries. And one of the more recent events was the launch conference of our 2020 report in Gabon that happened in January 2020. And during this high-level event that was organized under the patronage of the First Lady of Gabon, Burkina Faso, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, we had discussions on barriers to women's work and all the gaps that still persist. And this event spurred a lot of policy reforms in Gabon. And so the country actually became the 2022 report's top reformer. Gabon enacted significant changes to its civil code, and for example, equalized women's property rights and introduced domestic violence legislation for the first time. So we have collected some anecdotal evidence of how law and policymakers are using WBL data. But we are also conducting country deep dives into women's rights, into reforms that countries have made towards women's rights to better understand how laws are changing. So we still have, we have published I think we have published like 3 of these country deep dives, case studies, one on the Democratic Republic of Congo, one in Kenya, and one in South Africa, but we still have a few more to come, so stay tuned. And here we have some examples of how the Women, Business and the Law data have been used, in particular within the World Bank. So our data has been included in the country gender scorecards in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that was organized. It was a collective effort by the regional vice presidency, the regional gender coordination teams, and the Latin America Gender Innovation Lab and the poverty economists. So these country gender scorecards highlight our data, but also other economic indicators that are relevant for the countries in the region. We also have the South Asia Regional Profile that informed the South Asia region gender assessment plan. That was a cross support done by our team and the South Asia team that is published on our website. Very interesting regional profile if you want to access. And also our data have been used to inform lending operations within the World Bank. So what's next? We hope to continue developing these new indicators that we mentioned, all the childcare, the implementation of laws. We hope to continue collecting our data, capturing reforms, understanding how countries are making these reforms. hopefully seeing an uptake of reforms in the coming years, and hope to continue collaborating both with colleagues within the bank and with civil society, NGOs, and activists looking to do the right thing and working on the ground to change the reality of so many women around the world. And here I'll just finish up. If you want to learn more about our work, we encourage you to visit the website at wbl.worldbank.org. There you can view indicator-specific and economy-specific data. You can access the legal sources that we consult to build our index. You can read our recent report. There are blogs, country case studies, reforms database. There's a variety of interesting materials there. And here I also leave at the bottom, you can scan this QR code with the little dinosaur inside it. If you want to sign up to receive the WBL newsletter, that's where we communicate our upcoming events, research, and all the interesting things that we are doing in our report. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll get back to you, Koichi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia and Victoria, for your presentation about the main findings of the latest edition of the Women, Business and the Law report. We received several questions from our audience in advance, and a question also coming in during the presentation. Let me read those questions, asking both of you to respond. First question, the COVID-19 has impacted on people's work and life globally. How do you compare the pace of legal improvement for women in business before and during the pandemic? Any notable region or country-specific example? Any response, please?
I can take this one. Thank you. So that's actually an excellent question, because the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic have exposed and deepened global inequality. And for many women around the world, this could mean not only economic insecurity, but also threats to their health and safety, right? So in times like this, a legal environment that encourages women's economic inclusion can make women less vulnerable in the face of crisis. And if I'm not mistaken, in our last edition in 2021 report, we have recorded 27 economies from all regions have enacted reforms increasing gender equality. And this edition, as I mentioned, 23 governments addressed inequality by introducing legal reforms to ensure women's empowerment. But what I also want to bring to your attention is that in its 2021 edition, Women, Business and Law included data on the measures put in place by governments to address some of the impacts of the pandemic on working women, especially in the areas of childcare, access to the court system, and protection from violence. And I invite everyone to read our 2021 report to learn more about these measures put in place by government. But what's more important, by revealing how discriminatory laws prevent women from fully and equally contributing to their economies, the Women, Business and the Law makes the case for concrete reforms. And when women are equal, they're not that vulnerable in face of crisis.
Thank you, Victoria, for your responses. Let me read the next question. In the report, gap between the passage of laws and their supportive frameworks across the region is large in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa region. On the other hand, disparity between legal index and expert opinion scores is opposite. Is the reason of disparity caused from the weak practical implementation capabilities in these regions? If so, what is your suggestion for improvement? Sub-Saharan Africa has the largest gap from the expert opinion scores and WBL score, and 0 point in improvement in women, business, and the law score by the region. Does it mean current law have been introduced too fast for the region? Are non-nationals information aggregated or excluded by each country's statistical data? So these are the set of questions. Perhaps I would invite Natalia to come in to respond.
Yes. No, of course. Thank you, Koichi. And I actually really like this question because it makes it keeps our minds thinking as we develop this new area of research. That is true. When you look at the supportive frameworks and the answers of the expert opinion, you do see a difference in the types of mechanisms that potentially exist and also the perception of equality. And that's why we asked those questions. We really wanted to see from the people living in the country, what are their perceptions of legal equality, right? And but that's just a little glimpse of the reality, because as we mentioned during the presentation, we only covered 25 countries in this exercise. So it's very hard to draw conclusions with a very small sample. So I can't say, you know, the reason why there is a disparity is because of this and that. But and I'll mention an example. In South Asia, we only included India because it's the most populous country in the region. But because this is a pilot exercise, very small sample, it's very difficult to capture the full picture of implementation gaps in the regions, both from the supportive framework side, but also from the expert opinion side. And the question on have these laws have been introduced too fast? There's another aspect, which is maybe the implementation time frame may take a while after laws are passed. So it may be the case that recent reforms that have been passed, it may take a while to raise awareness, to actually put forth some regulations or some mechanisms that can actually transform, turn this law into practice. So what we're hoping to do this year, expanding the coverage of the research, is that we can have a bit more representative sample and also understand what could be some of these barriers on the framework side, and also understand on the perception side, how can these responses be correlated or interpreted. So I hope to have better answers and more insights maybe in the next opportunity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your responses. Next question. In the chapter for the child care, it seems no separated questions for children with special needs, like children with disabilities and medical care. Have you covered or haven't focused on legal and other systems for special needs? I would like to know how have you put the viewpoint from the life cycle with each life stage in depth analysis into depth analysis. When it comes to nursing them, care for youth and father will be required, or even caring several family members. Women with disabilities was mentioned. Then how about the special support if they become caregivers? Perhaps Natalia, once again, if you can come in to respond. Thank you.
Of course, no, and I think there are several answers for this question. But when we constructed the index and when we took this approach for the life cycle of a woman, we did that through a very thorough literature review to understand the economic impact of gender equality laws, and we identified all these aspects. So I think there was something on how we constructed the life cycle approach. But specifically on children with special needs and disability, our legal index and the new area of research of childcare do not include women with disabilities and children with special needs in its core in the index, but we do recognize that this is a very important area. And then I'll break my answer, I think, in like two-part answer. So related to childcare, because this is a pilot research, we really wanted to test out our assumptions to make sure that we're asking the right questions, that we're understanding the frameworks that exist first. And that's why we use some case study assumptions that are comparable, replicable, and we can eventually expand to cover all the countries that we cover. So hopefully after that, we can expand our analysis a bit more. But in terms of women with disabilities, we know that women with disabilities face multiple intersectional discriminations when they're compared to men with or without disabilities. So if we've seen that national statistics show that employment rates of women with disabilities are the lowest compared to men with disabilities. And women with disabilities face gender-based violence at much higher rates than non-disabled women. So knowing these facts, we started a new pilot research in addition to the two that I mentioned during the presentation, which covers the rights of women with disabilities. And under this new research, we have included questions in 4 main areas. The first one is non-discrimination and the mention of multiple discriminations in the law, parental rights for women with disabilities, and that would include becoming caregivers, as the person asked in the question, inclusive labor markets for women with disabilities, and also protection from violence and sexual harassment. So we did this pilot research in 2020. We started this exercise in 2020, and we found that only a quarter of economies around the world explicitly recognize this multiple discrimination on the basis of disability and gender. And our team is now working on a policy brief that we hope to publish in the coming months. So hopefully we have more insights on this intersectional issues, because we do recognize the importance, and we hope it can expand our analysis a little bit on this area. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much for your responses. Let me read another set of questions. The report says some limitations, and do you have specific concept of how to overcome those limitations, such as inclusion of rural, informal ethnic minorities, refugees, internally displaced persons, or non-status foreigners, or others who are much difficult to access, but more needs to be improved? It may lead endogeneity and selection bias. How will you evaluate fragile states and under conflict countries? So this time, perhaps I will ask Victoria to come in to respond. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I actually want to thank our audience, because I think we're getting like really great questions. So, and this is true again. Women business in the law recognizes that the laws it measures do not apply to all women in the same way. And women indeed do face, like, as Natalia correctly mentioned, intersectional forms of discrimination based not only on gender and sex, but also on sexuality, race, gender identity, religion, family status, based on whether they are located in fragile state or not. And with regards to women in fragile economies, they indeed do face multiple discrimination. For example, lack of education and employment opportunities, and high rates of sexual violence and abuse. What comes to my mind, we encourage readers to interpret women business in the law data in conjunction with other available research. For example, like there is a World Bank report on the equality of opportunity for sexual and gender minorities. Achieving gender equality requires a much broader long-term effort by governments, civil society, international organizations, and others. But legal and regulatory reforms can play a foundational role as an important first step. So in WBL Index, we aim to lay down a roadmap for progress over time and identify potential areas where more work is needed to inspire reforms that benefit gender equality. But we indeed do recognize that more work needs to be done by multiple stakeholders and actors.
Thank you for your responses. So we received several questions and comments during the presentation. Let me read those, and then perhaps ask both of you to come in together with your final remarks. Then we wrap up the seminar. First point, actually comment from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much for your point. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Finance for women is difficult for banks. However, crowdfunding is growing in Asia. In Cambodia, in Vietnam, female borrowers show much less default compared to men, and their businesses are successful. The same method can be applied to the other regions too. So that's a comment from Professor Yoshino. Thank you for your comment. The question from Professor Shimamoto from Kyoto. Thank you for your point. As you well explained, the practice is hardest hurdle to overcome. What is your thought as to the role of education? Any studies done in this regard? So I just read those point and question. I will ask perhaps in the order of Victoria and Natalia to come in together with your final remarks. Then we wrap up our seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koichi. I really appreciate both the time that we have here to present, but also the engagement of people that were watching. The questions were very insightful. And I really appreciate the two last comments, especially on the types of financing for women. We know that microfinancing plays a big role for women in certain regions. And again, the role of education, that's very true. Although we don't cover that in our report, we do try to do studies and deep dives that understand the impact on girls and women, how domestic violence impacts education outcomes. So those things those aspects are super important. And also education about your own rights, right? Like when you don't know your own rights, you can advocate for them. And that's very true. So I hope that you learned something today, and then if you do have more questions, you can email them directly to us. Thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Victoria so we can wrap up.
Thank you, Natalia. And first of all, again, I want to thank you for having us here today and for the engagement from the audience. I think it's been incredible, and it's really an honor and pleasure for us to be here today and answer all the questions and wonderful comments in terms of education and finance. My final remark, just that reforming laws to achieve greater gender equality should remain a priority for multiple actors, for governments to enact measures to recover from the shocks imposed by the different types of crises, for civil society organizations and other actors. And we welcome your feedback and your comments, and we're always available. Please reach out to our team and we will be able to answer all further questions. Thanks for having us today and good luck.
Thank you very much. We had a pleasure of having Victoria Kaitina, the legal consultant at the Women Business and Law program, presented the first half of the presentation. And then we had Natalia Mazzoni, the private sector development specialist in the same Women Business and Law program, taking the part of the second half of the presentation this morning. Thank you very much for both of you being with us this morning. Really appreciate it. Thank you. The next week, we are introducing the latest the edition of the Africa's Pulse, the half-yearly economic update of Africa region. This will start at 8 a.m. On Friday, May 20th in Japan Standard Time. With that, I would like to once again say thank you everyone for watching the seminar. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much.